All right, we should be live. I'm here with Joel Davis, who some of you may be familiar with. He's done work in Postliberalism, former co-host of EBL. He has a YouTube channel that I've linked in the description, a Twitter account, and yeah, doing some of the more interesting stuff in the minute, I'd say, in the dissident right, if you're okay with that label. So yeah, maybe if you just like to introduce some of the stuff you're working on at the minute, Joel.
Yeah, so I mean, to explain it all would be kind of complicated, but basically, I tried to have a political belief. I mean, if you want to go back to like why am I doing this stuff? I tried to have political beliefs, and then all of the different political beliefs that were made available to me had their own kind of. I tried to believe in them, and then I found problems with them, and then eventually I just ended up on this exterior where it was like, okay, well, every option that's available has flaws. What now? I guess we have to like build something new from scratch. And I came into contact with some of you might know his Twitter account, Imperius. Came into contact with him, who introduced me to the work of Adam Katz, who at the time was just some like obscure blogger in the kind of neo-reactionary sphere. And I got into his work, which seemed to be very different to anything else that I had seen beforehand. And that caused me to start, going, okay, this is interesting. I started reading more widely in philosophy, trying to make sense of some of the more fundamental questions necessary to answer to be able to like build a worldview from scratch, inspired by Adam's work. At that time, I became good friends with a YouTuber. Many of you might remember him. His name was True Dill Tom, and we became close friends and collaborators, and we kind of proliferated the kind of synthesis of Adam's ideas, which are based in most fundamentally in this this theory, generative anthropology, which is a theory about the origin of language and its implications for essentially the perennial philosophical questions, and postmodern philosophy, and trying to say to the dissident right, instead of like recoiling back to a traditionalist viewpoint, respect that history has moved in a direction for a reason, and try and figure out how to make sense of history and embody history rather than just being dragged along kicking and screaming by history. And so that's kind of been the project ever since. Like, how do we actually make sense of, our, as Heidegger would say, our thrownness, the fact that we are kind of born already with a history and a culture that we're embedded within, that conditions how we think and how we approach the world, whilst at the same time actually doing something to move it along. Because obviously humans haven't just thought one thing forever. There's been constant updating and development and transformation in human culture and human thought. So how do you understand that process in such a way that you could participate in it and bring about a new form of political consciousness, or even just, you could even say just consciousness in general, into being, which I think would be necessary to kind of progress beyond the current political categories, which, as I said, I found them all wanting. And so that's kind of been the project, I guess you could say. That's why it's called post-liberalism, because obviously we're in a liberal paradigm. I believe there is something that liberalism is doing that is necessary, or that makes historical sense, that needs to be reckoned with, which we can get into. And I don't think just simply becoming illiberal or rejecting liberalism is sufficient. We have to figure out why liberalism has colonized the world, essentially, in order to figure out how to move beyond it to something that could actually challenge. Obviously, we're on the dissident right because we see all these destructive aspects to our culture. Essentially, it seems like what our culture is saying to you, particularly if you're a white male, but if you're just a white person in general, is kill yourself. If you don't kill yourself, you can't actually satisfy all the demands that are placed upon you. It's literally gotten to this point where there is absolutely zero justification for a normal person living a normal life within current political discourse. Obviously, this is highly dysfunctional, and something radical needs to be done about it. So I guess that's kind of the context. And then for me personally, it's about trying to figure out the philosophical and interdisciplinary aspects to this question. How, because ultimately, the society that we live in is a technocratic society, and basically, we can see right now with the coronavirus, for example, the government policy is kind of downstream of what the experts tell us to think or tell us is true, and this is the case in virtually, if you think about it, pretty much every aspect of government. Economic policy is what economists tell us to do. The legal system is designed how legal theorists tell us to design it, and so forth. You're going into every aspect of government, and there's a discipline of kind of bureaucrats and technocrats that are kind of telling the government what to do or telling us how to think in a particular area. So the question is ultimately, I believe, a philosophical one of how to actually transcend that and think anything differently than kind of the ideology that's being projected upon us.
Yeah, generative anthropology seems like the main sort of contribution to come out of your side of things. But I think when people look at it, they don't immediately see the political implications of this. It seems very sort of abstract, this theory of how language developed. I think it's from, this is kind of inspired by, is it René Girard, the French postmodernist, this idea of like mimetic impulses and...
Yeah, I think it's a harder way of explaining it, going through the process of understanding generative anthropology as a discipline. Whilst I do believe Girard's theories and GA, generative anthropology, is interesting, and obviously generative anthropology is very important to the work of Adam Katz, and it does influence me. Eric Garnes, the guy who created generative anthropology, he's not a member of our political faction. I've actually met him in real life before, and it was an enjoyable experience. But he's like a neocon basically, and a humanist, a kind of like a romantic. His viewpoint is essentially just a kind of basic bitch conservative viewpoint. Like he was spouting Fox News talking points at me, like Dinesh D'Souza style. What about black unemployment, stuff like that. So it's important to understand that what Adam Katz, is he read all these different implications into the theory that weren't actually in that theory. And he did this through all other kinds of influences. And I think to actually explain the theory, rather than going through the tradition, I think it's easier to just kind of explain it, in the sense that if you think about what political belief is, or political ideology, or political belief is ultimately constructed within language, obviously. You can't really have a political belief if you don't have a language with which to articulate it, or understand it. And language itself is something that is, socially, historically constructed. We enter into language through socialization. We don't, how many of us have actually invented a word? Even very few. So pretty much everything that we say is kind of imitated from people around us. And so ultimately the question, because we have the sense that we have our own beliefs and our own thoughts, but ultimately that's a question of interpretation. There is so much information, there's so much language all around us. And what political ideologies are is a particular way of interpreting that information, a kind of a filter, a kind of a system which processes the information into a way for us to share an interpretation, and therefore we can politically organize as a faction. Because and it's not just ideology. It's like this. Obviously, religion is the same. What makes you a Christian is that you have a particular interpretation of the Bible, which places a certain importance on the Gospels, and there's certain things that you believe that kind of condition that interpretation. And all the different denominations are different ways, like theology is essentially different methods of interpreting the Bible. And so the question of political belief is ultimately a question of, I think, interpretation. Ultimately, what is interpretation? And, what would it mean to interpret interpretation or understand interpretation? And in order to understand this, I think you need to go to literacy. understanding. There's a really interesting book that I'm reading right now, actually, which is fundamental to Adam Katz's thinking. Perhaps the second most influential aspect alongside GA, The World on Paper by David R. Olson. And in it, he discusses the kind of the cognitive implications of literacy. He describes how, the practice of reading and writing is something essentially quite new in human history. Like we didn't have like alphabetic writing scripts and, advanced literacy until essentially around 600 BC, what Carl Jaspers calls the Axial Age. And this had a lot of interesting implications that we don't think about because we are literate people. He talks about how, if you think about something, a notion like evidence, or a notion like truth, or a notion like, anything to do with like epistemology at all, you can't really imagine how one could form a concept of these things if they were non-literate. Because say you are interpreting a piece of information differently than me, and we have no writing to appeal to, no concept of reading and writing to appeal to. How am I going to challenge your interpretation? How are you going to challenge my interpretation? There's nothing that I can appeal to. There is simply just a way of speaking, and there is a kind of consensus that forms about speaking about things in a certain way. And so this is why you see in pre-literate societies, you see the prevalence of magical thinking and mythical thinking. The work of Jean Gebser is particularly influential on me here in understanding what pre-rational, pre-literate human societies are actually like, which is that essentially their understanding of the world is embedded within one cohesive narrative in which essentially everything is related to everything else. And that includes language. There is no concept of language or words being distinct from the things that they actually represent. There's no distinction between something like a name and a word. So when, that's why you have a notion like magic, which seems ridiculous to us now in 2020. But a notion like magic was intelligible in, pre-literate societies because they had no concept of the fact that speaking about something was not the same thing as that thing actually existing. And, I won't go through all the evidence for this, but ultimately you can see how this kind of thinking would then develop into mythological thinking, or mythical thinking, I should say, where, all the different aspects of a society were embedded in one kind of cohesive narrative. Everything was related to everything else. And this is what you see in pre-literate pagan, mythological systems. There's a god for every function. And there's like a whole bunch of stories and narratives that tie all these gods together so that there's like one kind of giant narrative that explains every kind of facet of human behavior and human life. What happens when literacy emerges, and literacy emerged originally, according to the anthropological analysis I've done, literacy emerged originally for recording transactions. Prior to the advent of markets and the advent essentially of civilized society, there was no need to necessarily record transactions formally because you lived with a tribe or a bunch of other people that you saw every day. And so if you did something for someone, or someone did something for you, or someone gave you something, or you gave someone something, you didn't need to record it. It was remembered by the entire community. And it was, basically everything was shared. We were essentially communistic at that point of development. Not until you have trade between two people that might not see each other again for a long time, or between people that are kind of out of the reach of the community, that can't be held responsible necessarily for, giving and receiving for debts in the same way that you could if you all lived in one community together at all times. Then it becomes necessary to start recording transactions and kind of exteriorize our memory in a kind of rudimentary writing system. Over time, this then develops. Obviously, once you start having transactions, you need to have something like a kind of, a prototype form of a legal system, because you're going to have disputes over transactions, over whether someone is paying what they owe you or what have you. And then this requires a whole other kind of writing, which is to record legal procedure. And this ultimately develops into epistemology and philosophy, essentially inquiries into how can we determine when people enter into a dispute who is right and who is wrong. And this is where ultimately we need to start forming a concept of interpretation, an idea that my interpretation, your interpretation, his interpretation is different, and that words and their meanings are different from the things they actually represent, and also our intentions as people who use words and interact with things are also different. And so this understanding all kind of emerges out of the practice of having to understand grammar, understand writing, understand knowledge. And for the first time, you have something like self-aware subjectivity as a result, because ultimately, if I have a different interpretation to you, or I have a different intention behind meaning than what a word means in and of itself, or what a thing actually is, we have to locate where this intention or where this interpretation is taking place, and that forces us to construct something like a subject as a location wherein interpretation can be alienated from other interpretations. And this is, I think, the kind of beginning of the West in a certain way. Like what makes Western civilization what it is the kind of advent of subjectivity within like the kind of practice of interpreting language, in a kind of like a meta representational practice, like having to understand representation itself. And I think this is the fundamental problem that we're still dealing with all the way up to the present day politically, is first of all, how to deal with the fact that a whole bunch of people have different interpretations of the world, which means if we all have different interpretations of the world, we're probably not going to come to the same decisions. We're not going to agree on what decisions should be made within the society. So previously in a ritual, communistic, tribal society, we had one narrative, one set of rituals, one set of practices that made sense of everything. There was no real need for disagreement. You just, in the same, there was no real need for the, radically different interpretations of the world to exist and become a problem that needed to be dealt with. Whereas, by the time we get to ancient Greece, now you have a proliferation of all these new philosophies and all these new ways of understanding the world that basically require something like public discourse to figure out how are we supposed to interpret the world so as to act, so as to make decisions and have a legal system and have a political order. And so this problem was, I guess you could say, solved. I don't think actually solved, but this problem, I guess you could say, produced bureaucracy, essentially, or dogma, you could say, or ideology, or religion even, where you have a particular set of principles that are then generated, which we can then process all of reality through, that could become a dominant system of interpretation that then can become institutionalized and can control society, or at least control the political system through the kind of intelligibility that it confers upon all the various institutional practices of the political order. And this produces a kind of alienation, because if you have some kind of dominant dogmatic bureaucracy that forms, inevitably there'll be somebody with a different subjective interpretation who will then become victimized by the dominant interpretation of society. And there'll be this kind of conflict between the individual subjective interpretation and the kind of institutionally dominant interpretation. And this is essentially like the paradigm out of which liberalism emerges, where we have notions like free speech or whatever that are so like sacred in modern American society in particular, because of this fear ultimately of a giant bureaucracy that'll basically negate subjectivity, will dominate interpretation in such a way that it can centralize power. And that's the critique that's given to fascism or communism from liberalism. But I guess like the radical thing to kind of notice is that liberalism is itself a dogma, and it itself produces a bureaucracy. It just does it through sleight of hand. It just hides itself better than these other kind of so-called totalitarianisms, which is why the neoliberal world order that we're all living in right now is increasingly looking like just as much of a totalitarian society as any of its supposed enemies ever did. So I guess that ends up becoming a very interesting question. How did we get here to this point, and what do we do about it? Because liberalism encourages us to, affirm our subjectivity by understanding it antagonistically against the political order as a whole. And so we fight against totalitarianism, or we fight against a particular bad ideology, and we join the good fight of a particular supposed negation. The Cold War is one example of this. But ultimately, this is always just a sleight of hand to pass you into a different form of ideology. And generally, the constitutive character of liberalism is that, ultimately what ends up getting generated, and this is not a radical thing to say, it's kind of been noticed by quite a lot of people, is that it ends up being an ideology that just affirms the power of capital, of the dominant class of investors, and essentially money. Because if you look at the structure of all the different political beliefs, all the different major philosophical schools, and particularly social scientific, social science, the different social sciences, all the different paradigms in economics or sociology or what have you. Ultimately, if you just follow them to their root and follow the money, some wealthy billionaire, usually connected to they're a wealthy billionaire because they're an investor essentially, has funded these things into existence. And if you look at the media, which then ultimately proliferate all of these ideas, and obviously the academy, who staff the bureaucracy, these things are all kind of centrally coordinated through links of funding that go back to this same body of dominant capital. And so that leads us to the question, okay, what is capital then? Because it seems to be this kind of concealed sovereignty, which kind of rules by concealing the fact that it is ruling. So that ends up opening quite interesting questions about economics and so forth. I don't know if I've been talking for a while. I don't know if you want to say something back.
Well, I'm just kind of curious, from the perspective of, this approach is sort of starting with language and, deconstructing the basis for belief around language. Does that then lead to a kind of philosophical quietism like Wittgenstein? Would you think in a kind of sort of post-metaphysical way, where you'd see a lot of the dominant debates in philosophy as being sort of disputes around language?
I did think that at first, but I've since realized the error of thinking in that way, due to studying Heidegger closely and other philosophers like Henry Bergson, Gilles Deleuze. Because if you think about language, ultimately, what is language? That forces you to ask some pretty profound and technical questions philosophically, because obviously there's kind of two aspects to interpretation, subjective interpretation, which is constructed in language, which is there is, I guess, the two sides of Derrida's difference. You have difference, which is the fact that existentially we perceive our thoughts as happening for us in a certain way, that they don't happen for anybody else, which is a genuine experience that has to be explained somehow, which a lot of deterministic theories, like you look at Marxism is a good example of determinism, where you have this kind of historical model of economic relations, which is ultimately constitutive of ideology. And so they kind of move around the subject and see these historical forces of economics or economic relations as being constitutive of our beliefs. And so ultimately there is no space for genuine thought or subjectivity in this way of thinking. Another example would be biological determinism. You see this with scientific interpretations of racialism, where every race has certain biological characteristics which give rise to its political beliefs. And so, politics and thought and culture are just downstream from, some kind of biological process that has been fostered by evolutionary processes or whatever, which ultimately determined by, you just kick the can down the road to physics eventually with that view. And I reject these kinds of ways of thinking because ultimately there are two kind of aspects to subjectivity. There is the fact that you have this genuine existential experience of thinking for yourself. And then you also have the deferral of subjectivity, which is the fact that subjectivity is constructed as a process. It has a history. You have a history. There's a set of practices and disciplines constitutive of subjectivity. I was just talking about the production of literacy, like learning to read and write. There's studies that developmental psychologists have done on children, referenced by David Olson in the book that I mentioned earlier, which talk about how children don't really apportion subjectivity to beliefs and differentiate beliefs from reality until, from the ages of like 4 and 5, they only just start doing this, which is around the time people start learning how to read and write in our culture. And not until they're about 8 or 9 does this kind of fully form, where they start, that kind of giving subjectivity to everyone in relation to language. And so to see the subject as historically generated out of certain practices, and the fact that we live within a culture, we live already thrown, as I said before, within a language, means that there is a kind of historicity to consciousness, a kind of a history that you weren't there for. So, obviously, we're both part of Western civilization, but we weren't there for the first 2,500 years of it, or however you want to date it. But it's given to us in different ways, by indirect means, and we can't ever really escape it because we're kind of constructed within it in a certain way. And so what these two things have in common, the fact that I experience difference for myself, like the fact that, my thoughts seem to be for me in ways they aren't for anyone else, and this, historicity of being, of my being, embedded within a history and a culture, is that these two things occur within time. You can't really imagine thought outside of a time within which it can actually occur. There's a certain duration to processes of thought. And even if you try to interpret something, if you imagine what it means to interpret anything, ultimately interpretation requires you to synthesize all these aspects of your memory. So you only know something as something because you have a whole bunch of images of things similar to it or equivalent to it that you kind of bring up and kind of connect to it through language. So if you see the color red, you have a whole bunch of memory of seeing the color red and various other instantiations, and you're kind of connecting it into this series of kind of similarity and recognition. And all interpretation works like this. Is how metaphor works. You understand something as something else that you already understand, something you already remember. And so the process by which memory is kind of brought up and connected to some kind of image that you're perceiving presently, and you're able to understand or interpret something as something, is ultimately this kind of temporal process. Much like obviously history is temporal, it wouldn't make any sense any other way. And so this led me into thinking about, philosophy of time, particularly like the ontology of time. And this is where I think the work of Bergson is quite interesting in particular, because his whole philosophical project is essentially critiquing Western metaphysics for putting space before time, understanding time in terms of space, when he argues that time is necessarily ontologically subjacent to space. And so, philosophers that get associated often with modernism, and therefore with, how liberalism understands itself, like Descartes or Kant, their philosophy is fundamentally generated out of presupposing a subject. So like if you're looking like in Kant, essentially for Kant, we can't basically understand anything. We can't have understanding, literally, the faculty of understanding, without there being some kind of transcendental subject that is already preloaded with a set of categories that provide schemas of essentially production of objects to our sensory apparatus that construct objects for us within consciousness. This is kind of hailed as like the kind of grand completion of, modernist philosophy. And this is a similar kind of presupposition that you see carried through in something like economics, where you see in mainstream economics the belief that ultimately The economy is composed of rational agents that make these things called choices that are the ontological beginning of all economic interaction. Everything is justified as the product of people interacting and making choices and convincing other people to make choices. And so we kind of just begin with subjectivity in this way of thinking and presuppose it as already existing without it being constructed in time. And then we go about understanding the world as like flowing from that. And that introduces all kinds of paradoxes, and also encourages this kind of antagonistic way of thinking that I was describing earlier, where you have your own subjective interpretation against the dominant interpretation of society that you're constantly rebelling against, and makes you liable to capture by an ideology you don't realize you're a part of, because you believe that your subjective interpretation of the world is just yours and it doesn't have a historicity, it doesn't have a practice that it's constructed out of or embedded within that you share with others, and that was constructed by others in a history that doesn't include you. So, I mean, I guess the real question is, when it comes to the question of time preceding space, is if time precedes space ontologically. When Bergson argues the reason why this is true is because if you think about what space is ultimately something that we understand through abstraction. We insert a bunch of intervals, numerical, mathematical intervals, into experience and kind of divide it up into sections. We insert intervals of discontinuity within the flow of experience, so to speak. And then we create a model out of the relationship between these objects that we've arbitrarily constructed. And Bergson says this whole process of coming to awareness of spatial relations, whilst obviously important for various reasons, is something that occurs within time. And so within time, we go about constructing spatialized thought, understanding objects as distinct from one another and in relation to one another. And we get ideas like causality, and we model things like systems and so forth. And Bergson says, you can't go about doing all of this without first respecting the fact that subjectivity is temporal. And this is why this kind of way of thinking was very influential to Heidegger, which is why Heidegger built this very complex philosophy centered around the notion of Dasein, which is essentially, you could say, equivalent to subjectivity for colloquial purposes at least, coming to awareness of itself. And that in this kind of radical historicity that I described, but also in the kind of personal aspect to it. And so the relation between these two forces seems to be the kind of tension that is like driving the Western psyche, where we have on one side of the coin this appeal to go all out on the subject and kind of block ourselves off from recognizing our embeddedness within history, and that just powers the reproduction of the capitalist overthrow and centralized control of society through its ideological productions and the technocracy that justifies its rule and its accumulation of power. Or on the other side, throwing out the baby with the bathwater and negating our subjectivity and some kind of deterministic model in which everything in history is determined by these other processes that but you don't actually have any participation in which case, what's the point of actually doing anything or thinking anything, because ultimately everything has been determined outside of you. And so just another form of bureaucracy, another form of forcing an interpretation down your throat in which you have no space for genuine creativity. And so there's a necessity, I think, to build a new political or meta-political understanding in which creativity is celebrated. The fact that creativity is a kind of very radical thing, that it isn't just like the arbitrary, you don't just have like a subjectivity, some internal mental space composed of nothing where you just kind of make random shit up and that's creativity. Creativity is actually this dynamic relationship between a kind of existential subjectivity which experiences itself for itself in relationship with its memory, with its historicity, with its temporal structure. And so this is where you have something like the character of a people or a personality that ultimately is the ground of, I think, genuine authenticity and freedom, which is that in order to be genuinely creative, like if you think about an artist, like a great painter or a great musician, in order for them to do something that's, create something genuinely new, they have to kind of already understand there are all these genres that already exist. there are all these techniques that already exist in their particular like domain, whether it be painting or music or what have you, and they have to kind of take certain influences from various different things that have happened within their history, and they have to synthesize them in a radically new way and generate something genuinely new. And I think this is like the essence of ultimately what genuine, spontaneous creativity is as a human being, is being able to, use language as this apparatus that enables us to organize our memory, organize our historicity into novel configurations in response to problems that don't have obvious solutions, where there isn't already a kind of bureaucratic logic that gives us a blueprint for how one should act in all cases. And so no thought is required. Like genuine thought, genuine creativity requires this kind of dynamic interplay of coming to terms with, our temporality as subjective interpreters of the world. And so this, if you want to like, okay, well, so what's the political implications of this? Political implications of this is ultimately, if you want a society in which creativity is empowered, because ultimately the force that drives history, that defines what it means to be human, and defines like the kind of I guess the point of being alive in the first place, is the creative, this kind of perpetual creative becoming of culture and of human being.
Creative advance into novelty is how Whitehead termed it. I always thought that was a good way.
I mean, Whitehead is another similar kind of thinker, I guess, to thinkers that have inspired me. I haven't read much of Whitehead as of yet.
Yeah, well, he was heavily inspired by Bergson. Bergson and Bradley were like his two main inspirations. So
yeah, that makes sense. Well, anyway, so like the upshot of this is, okay, if you want to actually have, you can't just have a whole bunch of people doing whatever they want in pure anarchy, because that's ridiculous. We need to have a society that functions in a certain way. This problem, it still exists, and needing to figure out how do we interpret things in a way that we can share an interpretation, but authentically share it, rather than just impose bureaucratic logics on people where we tell them that the interpretation has already been determined by some external factor, theological, ideological, or dogmatic, and you have no say in it. And the way in which this is done, if you think about anything in society that actually works, is through delegation and trust. That, if you think about it, say you're running a company and you need to do certain kinds of research and development. If you're the CEO of, say, Apple, and you need to make a new phone, you can't be the guy that designs every single thing, every aspect of the phone, figures out how to market it, does it, that's why you have a company. You have a whole bunch of other people that work out all these different problems that you need to work out to run your company. And so what that means is you have to figure out who you can trust. That's how you hire people or promote people. You figure out people that you can trust to say, hey, this aspect of the problem, I delegate it to you and I trust your creativity. Come back to me when you've figured something out. And if it works, I'm going to remember this and reward you, and we're going to know that we can trust you in the future for, if you think about a sports team, obviously the coach of a soccer team can't play every position on the field. They have to get 11 players and they have to give them positions, and those positions are relative to their strengths. They obviously give them some kind of direction, an idea of this is your role, but ultimately it's up to the player themselves to interpret that and actually act it out. And so a society which would be maximally creative, which would be maximally authentic, capable of actually embodying its history and genuinely participating in human being, would be a society in which you would have these networks of trust and these networks of delegated responsibilities functioning. And essentially what I see in society today is these things are being kind of not just destroyed or pulled apart, but like actively attacked by this kind of centralized bureaucracy, which conceals its power through convincing people that the things it believes are actually pieces of their subjectivity. Like if you are a conservative or a progressive, you aren't a conservative or a progressive. You've been conditioned by this kind of academic media ideological apparatus to hold that view based upon all kinds of manipulation that you've been introduced to from birth, through the way you were schooled, educated, the media you've been exposed to, etc. There are literally thousands of people working on the problem of how to get you to believe what they want you to believe. And yet it's sold as, oh well, the people have chosen. This is what democracy has given us, is freely, the kind of free. Obviously, it's ultimately all propaganda. It's ultimately all this kind of manufacture of consent, to use a popular phrase. So the question is, how do you actually run a society where you're not manufacturing consent to conceal the power of some, nihilistic bureaucracy that is ultimately just furthering the aim of increasing its own power, that doesn't actually have any kind of goal, any kind of authentic dealing with the history of who we are as a people, or with human creativity, but instead tries to subordinate us all to some kind of centralized bureaucratic logic. And the only way you could figure that out, I think, is by having ultimately somebody occupy the position of sovereignty that would be responsible for ultimately delegating responsibility in its most elementary sense within the political order, which I guess would seem authoritarian to a lot of people. But ultimately, that'd be the only way you could do it, because ultimately someone has to make a decision. Every creativity isn't something that you do by accident. Every great work of genius in human history has been very purposefully created by someone. And so, why should the political be any different? So from a kind of a question of political praxis, it would be, how do we get from the position that we're in right now, where no one actually knows exactly who's supposed to be in charge? I mean, we have a president, but it's very obvious, whatever you may think of Trump, that the dude isn't really in charge. I mean, he's got all these people pulling him in different directions. He's not. I mean, he has influence, but he's not really respected as being in charge. He doesn't performatively take control, and he's besieged by this technocratic capitalist superstructure that has its own agenda, which depending on how many conspiracy theory red pills you've taken, you might kind of understand in all different kinds of ways. But the fact remains that whatever you think of him or whatever you think of the world, the dude isn't in charge, really. And so the question is, maybe not necessarily him, but how does someone actually be put in charge that actually can bear the responsibility of the history of our people and actually creatively imagine a future in a positive sense, that he could go about delegating roles and responsibilities to people so that we could actually do things that were magnificent, and that people could be trusted to embody their own creativity in their own walks of life, and we could reward people for creatively changing the game, interpreting the world in radically new ways, and we could affirm this kind of proliferation of subjectivity in a way in which our society as a whole would actually move in some kind of direction purposefully, as opposed to what it is now, which just seems to be this kind of complex of internal warfare, soft warfare between these different factions vying for power, without any kind of grand vision of the future that we're fighting about. I saw it just before I came on. This is a kind of an older graphic. I'd seen it before, but it was brought again to my attention by Twitter, of what do British kids want to be when they grow up. The survey said they want to be YouTubers or vloggers. What do American kids want to do when they grow up? The number one most popular profession was to be a YouTuber or a vlogger. What do Chinese kids want to be when they grow up? They want to be astronauts. Yeah. And I think if you had that poll in the United States maybe 50, 60 years ago, astronauts probably would have won then. And so I think that really is indicative of how demented and retarded our culture has become because of this kind of warfare that is going on. So the question is, okay, obviously I don't have all the answers on how we're going to get from here to some kind of futurist utopia or something. But I think ultimately the practical questions are, how do you enter into all these different technocratic disciplines like political economy, jurisprudence, sociology, etc., and redesign them in such a way that they would be geared toward empowering creativity and some kind of centralized sovereignty capable of delegating roles within a paradigm of unleashing the creative potential of the civilization, which is something that I'm kind of trying to work on.
One thing is, though, like you said, you're not your philosophy isn't really illiberal; it's post-liberal. But I mean, a lot of those critiques kind of lend themselves to sort of traditionalist critiques of modernity and liberalism, like like that criticism of Kant. That, I mean, Kant is basically answering David Hume's problem that if you're an empiricist, if all you have is sense data, that you can't create a law like the law of induction. You can observe phenomena happen, and you can create a scientific law, or you can call it a scientific law, but you can't actually prove that, because if you're the turkey that gets fed every day, and the turkey can infer that it'd be fed on Christmas Day and he doesn't get fed, but it wasn't actually a scientific law at all. But Kant's answer is that there are synthetic a priori truths. There's things that we sort of presuppose that we have to have for any perception, like space, time, causality. And but as you said, Kant presupposes a transcendental unity of our perception. He presupposes the self, and Schopenhauer makes that critique that the self is created in space and time, and it's the principle of individuation, and actually the thing in itself, it is a thing in itself, not things in themselves, and so it's like a unified will. But Schopenhauer's philosophy sort of leads back to a kind of Vedantic sort of traditionalist worldview, and even like there'd be similar criticisms of Descartes when he starts with "I think, therefore I am," rather than say "I am, therefore I think." And even I think actually Michael Jones wrote a bit about that. That was quite interesting. Whig economics, like that, Adam Smith's economic theories, how closely related they were to like Newtonian physics, and it was basically like Newtonian physics sort of imposed on the economic realm. But I guess what I'm getting at, like a lot of those criticisms, even in terms of like the how political order is generated. Like you could see this in something like the criticisms that Joseph de Maistre wrote of Rousseau, like the generative form of constitutions, and or like Filmer's critique of Locke, like every government is naturally a monarchy. So I don't know. I guess what I'm getting at is like, what's the insight from liberalism and modernism that you're trying to integrate or hold on to? Because it seems like these are all criticisms of the whole like project of modernity to begin with.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think traditionalists make a lot of good critiques of modernity, but then when it comes to the question of what to do, generally it is like, oh, we should go back to some kind of set of dogmas that like were tried and true in some past era, and I think that's not really dealing with, okay, but then how did we get here? How did those dogmas fail in the first place? That to have been something that went wrong within tradition for modernity to be a thing. And what I contend that went wrong within tradition was this failure to really come to terms with the implications of the radical difference, so to speak, of subjective interpretation, which is, generally you see tradition is kind of structured in this kind of mythical structure, in which you have this kind of overarching narrative that gives you a set of dogmas through which you interpret the world. And there isn't enough space kind of carved out for creativity, at least within the Western tradition. I'm no expert in Eastern mysticism, and I actually like a lot of ideas in Eastern, like, for example, Zen Buddhism is something that I like quite a lot. And but when it comes to the West, which is ultimately what we're talking about, I think Christianity, ultimately as a kind of theological superstructure instead of an ideological superstructure, was itself a kind of failure to really come to terms with the kind of, as I said, like subjectivity as a kind of creative expression of will in and of itself, which is why people like Schopenhauer and then Nietzsche and so forth were rabid critics of Christianity. And people like Kant and Descartes were Christians. Kant was explicitly trying to defend Christianity, in particular, from reason, essentially, and the implications of reason. So I think ultimately it's okay, we're in this kind of post-Christian epoch. And the question is, okay, so then what do we actually replace it with? Obviously, we've kind of gone down this we have this kind of God-shaped hole represented by liberalism, is kind of active nihilism. Okay, ultimately, why do we do anything? It's always given to you in the negative. Or because if we did this, it would be totalitarian. Or if we did this, it would be fascist. And so we have to do whatever isn't fascist or whatever isn't totalitarian. I saw today some communist on Twitter, someone posted, they said something like, I'm thinking of buying a Netflix subscription just to piss off all of these, wignats that are complaining about pedophilia. This is kind of indicative of liberalism's relationship. Like whatever those totalitarians think, we think the opposite. And so the question is, how do you actually develop a positive doctrine which isn't just a mere regression to tradition? Because ultimately, it's not possible to just tell everyone be Christian again, because it seems ridiculous. Like, why should I accept this set of dogmas? Like, there should be a way of coming to the truth for myself. Ultimately, this was the insight, I guess, that kind of pushed Christianity along in a way that ultimately destroyed Christianity, because you have in the 13th century the nominalist revolution in theology that kind of overturns the Aristotelian cage that theology was kind of held within up to that point through the Middle Ages. And then you have the Protestant Reformation, which is obviously like, a rejection of some kind of bureaucratized dogmatic interpretation of the Bible, which ultimately produced this proliferation of interpretations of the Bible that ended up disintegrating completely out of things that you could even call Christian anymore. So how do we come to terms with this in modernity? I don't think we can just all become Hindus arbitrarily. Maybe that would be cool, but it's that Hinduism is something that has a particular history for particular people. And, what I'm saying is we need to have something that makes sense of our history, our historicity, authentically as Westerners. And I mean, I had a kind of interview recently with Jason Georgiani, the philosopher, and he just wrote this book called Prometheism, talking about this meta-narrative Prometheism that defines like the West in a kind of both pre and post-Christian sense, that he sees as like a more authentic way of capturing the essence of Western civilization. I found that idea very interesting and amenable to my beliefs.
I don't know what to think of Orthodox Christianity, but I think the Orthodox Christians actually have a lot of good critiques of some of that stuff, like nominalism, and even if like some of the early church fathers, like Gregory of Nyssa and Maximus the Confessor, they have this view of creativity that's very similar to what you get with someone like Ramanuja in Hinduism, which is like the individual self. What we are is a subjective expression of the absolute consciousness. There's much more of a place for this sort of absolutist understanding of things. But you look at Orthodox Christianity, and to a large extent they've kind of held on to their traditions. They haven't slipped through a lot of the problems that the Catholic Church has. So I don't know, just in terms of something that's kind of adjacent to the West, that's still in the Christian tradition.
Yeah, I mean, I'm open to those ideas that you mentioned, but the notion that Jesus Christ died on a cross to save me from going to hell is ridiculous. I don't really like having to say it, because it should just be obvious, really. The idea.
I'm not a Christian myself, but just in terms of something that in terms of like some kind of spiritual rebirth for the West. As you say, Hinduism isn't really is fairly unlikely, but it's not outside the realms of possibility to imagine a kind of Christian Renaissance, is it?
Something like, in Hinduism, the notion that ultimately what life is, and I know this notion they have this notion in Kabbalah as well, something akin to it, which is, imagine you are God. You have basically no limits. You're everywhere, everything, all powerful, all knowing, all seeing. Infinite in every dimension. What do you lack? You lack ignorance. You lack limitation. You lack weakness. And so this is the explanation for why we are, which is that this is divinity, entering into ignorance and limitation and weakness, just for the joy of coming to kind of like self-realization. Again, it's ultimately. And I like the mystic Alan Watts had this idea when he was trying to describe the Hindu concept of Leela, this idea of the divine play entering into ignorance willfully, where he said, imagine you could have a dream every night, and every night when you dreamt, you could live an entire life, and you could be anyone that you wanted. And every night you got to be a new person. You'd probably start off like, yeah, I'm going to be all these different rock stars and movie stars, and maybe I could be this great, I could be Napoleon, I could be Hitler, I could I could be Julius Caesar or whatever. You could pick all these different people to be, and it'd be really fun. Eventually, like say you could just keep doing this forever. Eventually, you'd kind of get bored of being all these different people, and you'd want to be someone else. Maybe you'd want to be surprised. You wouldn't even want to know who you're going to be. You just want to just hit the random button and then just become anything and everything. Because ultimately, what else would there be to do but to try everything out? And so this is the explanation for the kind of diversity or whatever of the castes and the different forms of life and so forth. Given that kind of way of thinking, I like. I mean, it's a cool way of thinking. But I think the basis of what I'm saying is not how do we have like a cool spiritual belief or whatever. The basis of what I'm saying is how do we make sense of Western culture where it is right now, politically or metapolitically even, because ultimately we're facing a situation which is drastic. We don't have the luxury of kind of sitting around meditating. What kind of society do we want to build, guys? We're under attack, and we're heading for, I think, war of one form or another. We're already kind of at war in a certain way, a kind of cultural war, a kind of soft war of sorts. And I don't see how it stops kind of accelerating in this direction. Obviously, there's already fighting in the streets in America. I mean, as I said at the beginning, it's the point where if you're a white male, there's nothing you can do to satisfy these people except kill yourself. And maybe even then they would sort of decide that like suicide is like white privilege or something. Who knows with these people? So there's nothing that you can do except fight at a certain point. But if we're going to fight, we have to figure out what are we fighting for? How do we coordinate it? And how do we fight on different levels? This isn't going to be a war that we just rock up with a bunch of guns and shoot people and win. It's going to be a war that is fought in the media. It's going to be a war that's fought ideologically. It's going to be fought at every level. And we have to be able to build a comprehensive political praxis that's capable of taking on this superstructure that I've described and defeating it. And so I think the only way you do that is through, ultimately, what do we have on our side? Authenticity, I guess, in contradistinction to their inauthenticity. And so how do you find the most authentic narration of what makes fighting this cultural war worth fighting? That's the question I'm trying to answer. And then how do you express that in all these different, really complex and technical ways in some cases to actually provide the kind of structure of understanding that we need to actually like take control of developing an authentic worldview that we can actually institutionally reproduce for our children and our children's children and so forth, and like safeguard something of value in the history.
Who is it that you're trying to appeal to with that more authentic understanding? Because it seems like the post-liberal side of things kind of shuns populism or movements like nationalism as a route to populism. So I guess the question is, who do you appeal to when we seem to have obviously no institutional support, no elites on our side?
No, I mean, instinctively I would side with populists and with nationalists. I mean, what the nationalists believe, if you like, there's obviously all these different brands of nationalists. I think they have, you can have certain critiques of their different kinds of nationalism. But what do they all share? They share this idea that we should have, that our nation has a history, and that history means something, and that interpreting what that means is the fundamental task of sovereignty of the state, interpreting what that means in such a way as to protect it, embody it, proliferate it, and expand upon it in the future. And so nationalist support, like they are pissed off that a president was elected recently that isn't able to be president, or they're pissed off that generally presidents are elected who are already bought and paid for and manufactured into the position in the first place. And there's no kind of authentic relation between our history as a people and the people that are running the society. And so I think they're correct. The problem that I have with populism is I don't think the solution to this is like, hey, let's just like red pill normies with like, based memes or something, and then magically through the kind of spontaneous awareness of, the average person, we just overthrow the system. That's a kind of delusion, I think. Ultimately, it's a far more complex question. And we have to figure out ultimately how to take on an enemy that has billions of dollars, that runs pretty much all of the media, that runs all of the academic institutions, that have this massive network of foundations and think tanks and NGOs that perpetuate themselves, and we have to figure out how to fight them. And we need to be ambitious, and we need to be comprehensive in that. That would be my only critique. I mean, obviously, there is a kind of tinge of elitism to what I'm saying, because I'm saying, well, ultimately, like, if we're going to have creativity, that needs to be delegated, and so you need some kind of like centralized, occupied sovereignty for that to function. But I don't think that populists or nationalists really disagree with that. I mean, it seems to me like populists and nationalists celebrate and respect, great leaders, and what they want is great leadership. So.
Yeah, so I mean, basically, like, what is the praxis? Because I mean, you lay it all out there. Like, we have no institutional support, we have capital against us, we've all these NGOs, the entire media complex, and just how brainwashed the mass of society is as well. I mean, it's I think there's a case to be made that at the minute there isn't much people can do except just kind of withdraw into your own sort of technological social spaces and like form their own kinds of communities and try and lose reliance on the system. But like, in terms of actually engaging with the system, like, where do we start from there?
Yeah, it's a good question, and like, I don't have all the answers to it yet. If I had all the answers to it, like, obviously things would be different because we would be fighting, because we'd know how to fight in a really complex way. But there are a few things that I think about this question. One is, I mean, I'm indebted, I think it must be said, to the aforementioned Imperius to kind of conceptualizing this kind of strategy. What direction is this going to take the next 10, 20 years? Which is that the Republican Party is going to reach a point soon where it can't win federal elections because of demographics. And that means there's going to be a point at which the Democrats monopolize the federal government, at which point you're going to have a bunch of red states, red state legislatures that are going to be like, well, I'm not really cool with a perpetually Democrat federal government constantly telling us what to do and taking away all of our sovereignty. And so you're going to get this kind of regionalization of the Republican Party, which will change their incentives because they're no longer managing a world empire. They're now having to figure out how to basically create sovereignty within red state America. Red state America has quite a few strategic aces up its sleeve. One, it seems to provide the majority of the military, like actual servicemen. Number two, it has the majority of the natural resources and high quality agricultural land in the United States. Number three, it has the majority of the gun owners in the United States. And number four, white people and other just generally normal people that are getting screwed over by the chaos that's going to be the American political system over the next few years are probably going to all try and move to red states so they can live in a society that's like at least semi-functional. So if you put all those factors together, that means that there's going to need to be a new political ideology, or maybe I don't want to really say ideology, but there's going to need to be a new political worldview worked out that represents this complete change of the strategic landscape, because the current brand of conservatism doesn't work and is lost. And it's just kind of like we're just kind of watching it lose as it goes. I mean, so if you look at like a lot of like the young right wing coming through, they're very populist, they're very nationalist. The Trump presidency meant something metapolitically, even if it's meaning increasingly less politically, because of how ineffectual the dude is for whatever reason. And so I don't think that political consciousness is going away. It's there is like a legitimate and authentic kind of reaction to how insane the culture is going. And so ultimately, I believe that it will be possible to organize that. There's going to be certain industries, there's going to be certain forms of wealth and power that are going to be shunted from the elite and have forced a group with this kind of regionalized right wing, I guess you could say. And these guys are going to have to develop a politics that enables them to actually challenge the established order. And so I think that creates a great opportunity to do something very interesting and create something genuinely new in American politics. And I think that's going to be what happens in the next 10 to 20 years. In combination with this, you have the fact that, you know, the American empire is literally falling apart at the seams because of how insane it's being run. And not just the United States. I mean, I noticed this in Australia. There's a whole bunch of advertisements everywhere for the like joining the military that I see when I go out or I see on television when I occasionally watch it. And every single one of those advertisements is directed at women. There's not one man. The font is all feminine and like, oh, join the army. It'll be great. We'll have all fun with the girls or whatever. That's indicative of, I think, literally how retarded our institutions are going to get, where, you know, it's going to be impossible essentially for anyone to do anything that actually works because it's all going to be just constantly choked by this bureaucratic red tape that's just constantly proliferating and getting more and more intense. And the reason why America was able to get to where it got in terms of global supremacy was because not only does it have a great geopolitical position, it has access to all, basically every key natural resource within its own borders, the world's best agricultural land, a really intelligent, massive population. It's almost impossible to invade by any foreign power, etc. Is that it had essentially a really innovative and creative people, a people that created all the innovations of like the space program, and you know, they invented the internet, and they invented all these different, like, had all these scientific achievements in the 20th century. They great industry that, you know, enabled it to become this kind of economic powerhouse. And if all that falls apart, you know, where are these people going to turn? You know, like, how are they going to keep, like, kind of like, they're parasites, essentially, people that run society. If there's no one left to parasite off, I don't really see where they turn except on each other. So I think you're going to have this confluence of very interesting factors. And I think cutting China off from the American world order and the geopolitical conflict that generates will also be an accelerant to this process. So I don't think moving to the woods and like establishing a commune is, I mean, you know, maybe it might be better for you as an individual, but it's not a solution, obviously. And I think it's, in a sense, cowardly. I mean, ultimately, we're going to have to fight. I mean, this is our birthright. This is our civilization. This is thousands of years in the making. I'd rather go down trying to fight than, you know, run for the hills.
Yeah, I mean, you know, when you talk about like a potential sort of reaction against the Democrats sort of monopolizing power, I mean, it's, I don't know, I'm very skeptical, like, because anytime there's any move for any kind of populism in the Republican Party, I mean, they respond to it, you know, in the harshest way possible. And I just looking at the donors for the Republican Party, you know, like, it's the, I mean, it's the political party of like Paul Singer and Sheldon Adelson and all these people. Like, I really do think that those people would rather watch the US just burn to the ground and move their, you know, move their homes and their capitals somewhere else than embrace the kind of thing you're talking about. So I don't know.
There has to be someone that doesn't want the United States to burn to the ground that has some cash. There has to be, because a lot of the people that are making cash are making it from the US functioning as an empire. And it's going to stop functioning if it keeps going in this direction. It's literally impossible for it to continue like this for much longer, because it's literally insane the way it's being run.
Would it not have to be a third party or something? I mean, how would they even wrestle the Republican Party from, you know, that side of capital?
Well, you'd need to create, like I said, an alternative metapolitical theory. I mean, like, the Republican Party is still fundamentally, in a certain way, a neoconservative party. The economics is essentially just apologetics for neoliberalism. And there are certain little, you know, nationalistic or populist elements that are kind of emerging. but as you said, struggling to really wrestle control in a very meaningful way. Like, they have to be taken on. There has to be some way of building an alternative political media and political, kind of like meta-political, theoretical, academic superstructure with alternative funding sources that could take it on and attempt to colonize the party. It has to be done. I mean, even if I knew how to do it, I wouldn't really go into the details here because it'd be giving away the game. I don't actually know exactly how this would be done, but I'm sure that it could be done. There would have to be something like that. There has to be a new version of the right wing created, but it can't just be a set of talking points. You have to see like how political factions created. Like, if you look at how the progressive political faction was generated in the early 20th century, or how neoconservatism was set up, or how neoliberalism was set up, you have this confluence of changing strategic circumstances, changing elite, a kind of new form of elite comes into play that previously didn't exist, and therefore new money and new interests come into play, and a new faction is formed which defeats an older faction that represents kind of a previous paradigm that's no longer as strategically dominant as it once was. And so it's about modeling how could we find an opportunity. But like I said, I mean, it's not like, you going along and supporting the system or the status quo works when the status quo still kind of works. And during the 20th century, America kind of worked, like more or less for middle class and up. And now it's no longer working. And so you're going to start seeing more alienated elites. And I think it's about figuring out how do you organize those people into a faction.
Yeah, but I mean, well, I'm skeptical anyway about I don't think I think the chances for a third party in the US are fairly slim. But I mean, if you look at it, if they were to try and do something with the Republican Party, I mean, there's an ethno-religious group that was like the top 10 donors at the last election, where we're all families from this group. It was 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats. It just seems like that they have their own interests, that they would never allow that two-party duopoly to turn into something other than a means of furthering their specific interests, that it doesn't seem like will ever line up with the kind of faction you're talking about. So would that not necessitate either the end of the Republican Party or some third faction?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it would necessarily be whether you create a whole new party or you take over the Republican Party, or exactly how it would work. I mean, that would be a strategic question. It doesn't really matter. But the point is, obviously running a political party for the interest of Israel might make sense for a small group of people, but doesn't make sense for a lot of people that are actually in America, that benefit from America being like working and actually, America's a world empire that doesn't really have an option to just be like a slightly less powerful country. Like everybody else is its enemy. America has a choice: either like reform and fix itself and dominate, or be destroyed. Because as soon as America shrinks, someone else will emerge to fill that power vacuum, and then they're going to fund the absolute worst politics that anyone could possibly generate within America into power, because they're going to want the country to kind of self implode. And so anyone who cares about defending against that outcome, who actually cares about America first before anything else, and has a kind of Promethean Western mentality like I'm describing, or even just like generally thinks that normal people being able to do normal stuff within like responsible, well-led constraints is the basis of any like well-functioning society that anyone sane would want to live in. I mean, ultimately, the alternative is ridiculous. Like, why would you continue to support hell on earth coming into being? So I mean, I do think there's not really a choice. We try and build an alternative political faction because it's the only choice that we have. And the question is, okay, criticize it because we want to figure out, okay, well, this might not work, that might not work. But there has to be some way of doing it. And so we have to just start asking this question: how would you do it? And I think that's where praxis starts. And there are good people within the American right that seem to be doing good things. We were speaking before the stream about how we do appreciate, even if we don't agree with everything they say, the analysis of people like Tucker Carlson or Nick Fuentes or what have you. I mean, it is possible to colonize, I think, right-wing media in the United States. The fact that we've had very little institutional support, look at the influence that the last 5 years have had on the media structure of the right. I mean, a lot has changed already, and a lot will continue to change. And so we need to try and make those same gains in the academy and make those same gains in other areas, and get more if we want to get funding from someone, we have to demonstrate that if we got that funding, we could actually do something significant with it. And so it's about building something that could be funded. I mean, I don't have $20 billion. So all I can do is try and build something or help build something that if I had $20 billion, I'd be like, okay, this would work. And ultimately, these things are mostly out of my control. All I can do is figure out how could I help. And I guess that's the attitude I think everyone should have. And if a functional, genuine, authentic society did exist or could exist in the future, what role could I play in bringing it about? And position yourself there. And, if everyone did that, then we have something serious to work with.
But are you so confident as well that that what we're seeing really is like the US sort of in this perpetual spiral into anarchy? In other words, I think this level of unrest, you kind of look at it and you think this is sort of akin to a color revolution. It looks like something that could only happen with the consent of the intelligence services. If and when Biden wins, I could easily see these sort of going away within a few weeks. Of
course.
Yeah.
But if Biden wins, then you'll see, if you think censorship is bad now, it'll get much worse, and you'll see an acceleration of political conflict. So the right and, I guess normal people aren't just going to just take it on the chin. I don't think there's going to be some kind of reaction. And the question is, how do we react in the best way? Because we have to fight. If you're being attacked, you have to fight back. I mean, there's no option. I mean, this is basically honor, pride, everything that matters. If you're a man, even if you're a woman, I guess, but particularly if you're a man, you're not going to take this on the chin. You got to do something. And so, how are we going to do something? We have to. I think just trying to invent reasons why nothing could be done is not really helpful. We have to try and think, okay, what's the best thing we could do? It's like if you're just about to get invaded and you've only got, an army of 500,000 and you're being invaded by an army of 5 million. Okay, maybe, chances are that you're going to lose a lot and a lot of bad things are going to happen and maybe they might win. But damn sure I'm going to go down fighting rather than just let them take over the country or whatever. So that's the position that we're in right now. We have to figure out how to fight.
Yeah, obviously, I share that position. I just, I guess I'm still skeptical that the elite will see this as monumental as you're presenting it, and that Trump's share with Hispanics has gone way up recently, and with blacks, and I don't know. It just seems like the Republican Party will kind of keep faith in being like any other sort of center-right neoliberal party in Europe that sort of functions in a two-party duopoly in a multicultural state. I mean,
well, neoliberalism is already kind of being blown up by the geopolitical conflict with China. I mean, you got to understand that neoliberalism was created at a time in which the Cold War was still occurring, and it made sense strategically to fight the Soviets and to fight Soviet influence. But China was part of the neoliberal system. It was an integral part of the neoliberal system that was established against the Russians. And so they're like a parasite on that system, and they've emerged rather from within it. And so if America was to continue to just keep being neoliberal, it would be maintaining the conditions by which China is going to keep increasing in its power. So it has to change in a very fundamental way its grand strategy, because its enemy is radically different. And so there is going to be change. But we're not just going to just have one politics forever. That never happens. Even like, even if the new politics that gets developed we also don't like, it's definitely going to change into something. And so there's an opportunity to try and say something about how it changes.
Yeah, and just maybe kind of an unrelated question, but like, do you think technology and improvements in technology and the spreading of the internet is kind of making a lot of these paradigms outdated, in that in terms of like change being top down and elite support, like you mentioned Fuentes earlier, like there was actually a funny article going around where they were I think it was Time that posted or something, but they were freaking out that during the DNC convention, that I think it was NBC and ABC News or something had a combined viewership of like 6,000 viewers on YouTube, and they've like total subscribers of 30 million. And Fuentes was on DLive, which is this Chinese like gaming site, and he had 13,000, and they were freaking out about this. But it just seems like the internet, and even look at something like the Trump campaign, it seems like it's revolutionized things in ways that you wouldn't have been able to predict 10, 20 years ago. And with crypto, with some of these advances, like there was just some interesting stuff coming out from the FBI lately, where they're like desperate to try and find a way to track Monero that can't be done at the minute. But do you think some of these technological advances sort of lend themselves to more anarchistic political formations?
I wouldn't say anarchistic, but they definitely changed the game in terms of like how propaganda, I guess you could say, disseminated, but how political consciousness is constructed, probably a better way of putting it, with less negative connotations, because it's not just obviously just propaganda. There is like something authentic being articulated, I think, in a lot of the media that maybe we would like. But yeah, the internet does change the game. I mean, obviously NBC or whatever is going to get way more views than Nick Fuentes because they're on television and a bunch of boomers are watching. But for the younger generation, there's a completely new medium that a lot of these older people that run all these political institutions don't understand. And yeah, it definitely, I think it has a massive effect on like exactly how we interact. It's so much more participatory than television. Obviously, there's no participation in television. It's so much quicker. Like I love reading the comment sections of a video or an article. Like someone posts an article on Twitter and a bunch of people comment or something, almost more than the actual content itself. And I think a lot of people share that idea. Obviously these things are. This is a key thing that we need to kind of study and work out, which is how these social media platforms are kind of using algorithms and using certain moderation techniques to push, certain political beliefs and destroy others. And there's going to need to be some kind of technological reckoning with these forms. If we're going to win the propaganda battle, so to speak, we're going to have to dominate these forms, and it's going to have to be more. I don't think it can just be anarchic. Like, I don't think we just are going to be able to win by like creating accounts on platforms run by multi-billion-dollar globalist corporations. Right? They're not going to make it that easy for us. We're going to have to figure out how to fight them in a higher agency way than that. And that means we're going to need money. We're going to need alternative platforms, or we're going to need to have guys on the inside, or I don't know exactly how it's going to work. But yeah, I think it does change the game, because when you think about how much time, even these boomers that watch TV all the time, think about how much time they watch TV versus how much time you spend on your phone or on your computer browsing the internet. I mean, people spend way more time on content, and focused content as well, because people might watch the news for like half an hour or something, and maybe one political program, and the rest of the time they're just watching rubbish like sports or movies or something. Whereas on the internet, it's far more interesting, and so there's a whole lot more political attention, and so you'd be able to create far more complicated, or at least complex, political identities. You're able to create far more complex narratives. People are going to actually take in more information. And so this makes it more difficult if you have some retarded bureaucratic ideology to like keep the game up. you actually, it's much easier, I think, if you're more authentic to win on a platform like this, because so much more is conveyed. Um, the whole left can't meme thing, like that's, I think, indicative of this. I think when you go to these forms, these new forms of sharing information that we have now through the internet, it's far harder to get away with being inauthentic. You actually have to do something interesting culturally to succeed. And so I think that's why the left can't meme, so to speak, or and why this kind of dissident right space has been able to punch way above its weight culturally.
Yeah, as far as as far as Europe goes in this in this geopolitical game, like I'm kind of curious how you'd evaluate that. Like I remember there was a protest in Dublin a couple of weeks ago about one of the anti-mask things, and some Antifa showed up, and it was kind of funny. There was video of them going around, like they were chanting "No Trump, no KKK, no fascist." You said something like this, but it's just like completely removed from anything that affects people here. But it kind of shows how much this stuff is colonizing the rest of the world. Like, I mean, I think the biggest turnout for anything here during the lockdown was a big Black Lives Matter protest, and that's the same across Europe. So it seems like, just in terms of like what we can do on the ground here, I mean, it seems like we're so sort of it's so contingent on what happens in the US. Like, even so, after the Trump election, like suddenly all of these new nationalist political parties were popping up across Europe. I think the Irish National Party formed like right after Trump got elected. It was like another wave of populism. So in terms of what we can actually do in Western Europe, like how limited do you think we are?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously I'm an Australian, if people haven't picked that up from my accent yet. I guess it is a little bit different being in Australia because we have a lot in common with America culturally, and we don't really have much of a history. We have even less history than the Americans do. And obviously there's a lot of ethnic convergence, and we ultimately both kind of generated by British imperialism. So we kind of have that like Anglo-spherical orientation. Which I can see why an Irishman, even though there's way more Irishmen in America than there is in Ireland, why that might feel a little bit awkward. But, ultimately, yeah, like insofar as people start speaking in English, which, I mean, I know a lot of people, I was arguing with with Russians on the internet. Well, not arguing, just kind of talking with Russians on the internet. And they learned how to speak English just to talk to a bunch of English speakers about politics, and they're all like, into Dugin, and they love Putin, and they're like proud Russians. It's like, you're such proud Russians. Why do you even know English? Why are you talking to me? Like, I would never think to learn Russian to talk to you. Like, I don't care. I'm happy with just knowing English and speaking to people in English. And so because the English speaking internet is full of, I think, all the best ideas, all the most interesting stuff. It's forcing young people around the world to learn English and interact in English in order to understand the coolest memes and watch the best movies and cool music or whatever. And so I think that's only going to make American culture obviously even more powerful. And so that's why the battleground, I don't even really think about Australia very much, because I think the default setting for Australia is National Socialism. I mean, up until the CIA forced us to become neoliberals in the 1970s, we were kind of de facto National Socialists. Like, we had something called the White Australia policy until like the late 60s. And we had like the majority of our key industries were nationalized. And we still do in a certain way, but I mean, traditionally we had some of the best living standards for your average person, and like a respect for the working class and all this kind of stuff that you don't really see in other countries. So, but let's say we were to have some kind of political revolution tomorrow. Like, do you think, I don't think the CIA would just allow Australia to just be different, would just be subtly forced to return to mean. And so if I wanted to live in a different civilization, really what matters is the political contest in the United States, because it is like the locus of cultural energy, and it will continue to be so, as long as it's the by far the most powerful entity within the English-speaking world, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. If anything, I could see even more formalization politically of the other Anglosphere nations being kind of integrated into the American apparatus. I mean, our intelligence agency is basically run by the CIA already. We have American military bases in our country that I think have nuclear weapons in them and stuff. So, I mean, I consider myself just part of the empire, really. Australia is like, I don't know, like a second weirder Texas or something at this point.
Yeah, it is kind of it is. I mean, like American politics is like the most blackpilling thing ever. But yeah, it is kind of funny. Like all these people from like Sweden and Russia and France and everything else on Twitter, like, and it's just endless discussion about like the American presidential election. But I know it's getting kind of late there. I might just read some of these super chats if you're happy.
Yeah, sure.
To finish up the next few minutes. Zero Schizo said, ask Joel his thoughts on Guillaume Fay's archaeofuturism. Don't know if you read that.
No, I didn't, so I don't have any thoughts.
Yeah, it's funny. I was talking to, I was actually talking to a French philosopher. He was interviewing me for this book he's doing on like online, like nationalism or whatever. And he was like so surprised that people in the West like take Guillaume Fay seriously because, I don't know, I think Faye is like this sort of funny character over there. Like he did porn and stuff and he like had all these wacky beliefs. So they were like really surprised to hear he had an audience in the West. It was kind of funny. John Browning said, History Bro said, to paraphrase, there is no right or left. There are those who want to protect the West and those who want to destroy the West. Yeah. It was kind of funny actually, the Fine Gael party, that's the like supposedly the centre-right, like Christian Conservative Party in Ireland, they put up like a list of their achievements the other day of like the most proudest achievements ever, and it was like all like abortion, divorce, all this kind of stuff. It was all stuff related to like destroying the family, which I thought was kind of funny. The stuff they're most proud of. Port Film Co-op said, Joel, what's your favorite Jean-Claude Van Damme film?
Again, I don't have one.
Did you see? Actually, that's one thing. Did you see Tenet?
Yeah, I did. Didn't we speak about it on Twitter?
Yeah, I think I was discussing with you on Twitter. Yeah, no, you actually liked that movie, so.
Yeah, I mean, I liked it. This idea that like the future is so disastrous that this like evil globalist entity of the future has to create reverse entropy weapons to come back and destroy the present to make themselves the new past, and destroy our history in order to like wipe over it clean. I thought it was like a pretty like potent metaphor for, I guess, the kind of direction that the globalist technocracy is going.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like Nolan is, I don't know. I feel like he's gotten to the point where like the studios will let him do whatever he wants, and now it's kind of him like enjoying his own clever.
I thought it was really cool, like the filmography, like the way that they filmed it, where people are going in reverse time amongst people that are going in regular time or whatever. I thought it was like insane, like visually to look at it. It was like epic in a way.
It was pretty cool, but it was I don't know, it was just pure spectacle. Like even some of the reverse entropy stuff didn't really make sense because he only applied it to like, I don't know, he only applied it to some things, and like it wasn't really, I don't know, it wasn't really reversing either. Like does heat becomes cold when you're in reverse? I don't know. It seemed like he was kind of selective.
Who cares? I mean, you don't have to overthink it.
Isn't that what he wanted? Yeah, but even
there's been no movies out of any note for ages. I was just happy to go and like sit in a cinema, and we have this thing. I don't know if it's called the same thing. I'm sure you have an equivalent called Gold Class, where it's like a cinema where you get a much bigger seat that reclines, and they like serve you drinks or food or whatever with waitresses, and you can like. Anyway, usually it's really expensive, but because no one's going to the cinemas because there's no movies out and the virus is happening, it's like the price of what a regular movie used to be. So I was just going there and just getting served drinks and like sitting on. It was kind of like just a fun experience. It was just like a date night with the missus, I guess. I mean, it wasn't like the greatest movie of all time, but at least it was ambitious and interesting. I think people just like hating on stuff at this point, like because of like internet commenting. You just want to have like the best take about why something sucks all the time. It's like, do you have to?
Christopher Nolan, he's my favorite director. Actually, I like all his movies, but I don't know. There was no heart.
What's your favorite Nolan movie? My favorite's The Prestige. I think that's an excellent movie.
It's a pretty standard answer, but I mean the second Batman one is pretty epic. I like Interstellar as well. I like Interstellar more than Inception actually, but I don't know. All those movies had a bit of heart. Like this was all spectacle.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be nice if you could hear the dialogue a bit better. But
That as well, yeah.
why did the main character just like care about that chick so much? Like they had no real like intimacy, and then he just cares about her now. Like it was kind of like, oh, that was a really like boring relationship that really means nothing.
Yeah,
But anyway,
the villain was kind of generic as well, even though Kenneth Branagh is a good actor. But
yeah, I wish he was Chinese.
yeah. Well, they probably sell it to the Chinese market. So, Pep for $2 says, "How to survive at university while being a third positionist? Just don't talk about politics.
Oh yeah, I guess yeah. Like I mean, if you're doing a degree that's like engineering or something. I mean, when I went to university, I remember I did this course, philosophy of like art and literature, and we had this 1 week where, and this is a few years ago when I was probably like peak red pill or whatever, and they had this class where they were showing us videos of Riefenstahl directing Hitler arriving at Nuremberg and saying, well, objectively, like her cinematic techniques are really good and the soundtrack's brilliant and like this is really like artistically well constructed cinema, but is it still art because it's so morally reprehensible? And we got to like talk about that, and I was able to like say my beliefs in a way indirectly. It was kind of fun to play with it. Like I feel like don't give it all away, but just like drop little red pill nuggets here and there if you're gonna have fun with it, I guess.
Yeah, you can have fun with it, but yeah, people are always, people are like, oh, how am I gonna like red pill everyone in my college? It's like, just get your degree, like no one cares.
Yeah.
You're extremely online into like third position politics, and they're like trying to get a HR job. Like, just get your fucking degree.
Yeah, like unless you're trying to like bang chicks, you don't really need to socialize that much.
Yeah, well,
and if you're trying to bang chicks, maybe like like recounting like the central tenets of like Julius Evolar's system is probably not a good way to get laid.
Listen to Alan Watts lectures and talk about like Zen Buddhism and whatever else they find. All that kind of stuff. John Wolf said, we'll have to catch the stream later. Keep up the great work. Thank you. Eternal Guy said, my Duganist girlfriend won't stop talking about you. I don't know if that's directed at me or you. Okay, sorry, I guess I lost internet. Looks like Joel is gone. But I was actually at the last super chat anyway. Let me find it. Ross C said we need to make our own deterritorialized states. Yeah, I don't entirely disagree with that. I'm just going to send Joel the link so we can get back in. But yeah, I think we should definitely focus more on community building, and I think what we've seen in the dissident right the last few years, I think there has been like kind of a realization that in terms of like just getting a Trump or getting an Orban or some populist figure to just elect him and win an election, and that'll solve our problems. I think people are more realistic now, and you even see it with something like Patriotic Alternative in the UK, where they're not especially focused on electoral politics. They're they're doing things on the ground, community building, that kind of thing. So I do think people are more realistic about praxis and stuff. But yeah, I think Joel is back. Yeah, sorry, I actually just lost internet for a second and dropped me out. But yeah, that's all the super chats. So we can finish off here anyway. If you want to plug anything or any final thoughts.
I do hang out a lot in my Discord server. So if you go to the link to either my YouTube channel or my Twitter, um, you'll find a link to join my Discord server. If you're interested in, you know, getting deeper into some of the ideas that I kind of went over here, I know there's probably a lot of people in the audience that are just like, "What the fuck is this guy talking about?" Because it was a pretty extreme dive through a lot of abstract ideas. But hopefully those of you that enjoyed it or that seemed to get it or aspects of it, maybe a few of you might have maybe I caught you. And so come join the Discord where we do all kinds of things. We have reading groups. We have a lot of other guys that are into these ideas, and you can have the social support to learn more. What I'm working on right now is I want to move a lot of the people in my community out of just posting on Twitter and Discord and making YouTube videos into blogging and other like longer form writing. Ultimately, I want to create a journal, like an academic journal, I guess, to kind of organize all of our ideas into. And so I guess if you follow us or you want to start following us, keep an eye out for those developments over the next coming months. Because I think that medium is more conducive to working out these ideas than just trying to have the best hot take on Twitter. I see a lot of smart guys on Twitter that just keep saying the same shit over and over again in slightly different ways because it like generates a bunch of likes. Like I noticed that when I kind of converted my views into like dogmatic repetitions, like heaps of people liked what I said, but when I said things that were a little bit kind of new and different, like it was less popular. And so I think the mediums just kind of rewards you for just pumping out the same shit over and over again.
Retweet if you think white people are great.
Yeah. So I'm trying to encourage people to come along for that ride. I mean, I know some people obviously do blog and things like that with us.
Actually, there was just one super chat just came in because you mentioned Jason Reza Georgiani. I think you've been talking to him. This guy, Judge Holden, for $10 said, y'all's thoughts on the apocalyptic eschatology of Jason Georgiani's techno-Prometheism. I don't actually know a whole lot about it. I saw a Georgiani interview with, I think it was John David Ebert. So that's like the total extent of my knowledge of it. It's just like an hour interview. But yeah, you could probably give that a better answer.
Well, it's important to recognize that apocalypse, like etymologically, doesn't mean like some Hollywood movie where we have like a whole bunch of earthquakes and aliens invade and blow everything up or something. The apocalypse basically means like a great unconcealment, a kind of like bringing into the light and out of the shadows, so to speak. So I think what he means by that is, what he means by that is very complicated, so I'm not going to say what he means by that is this. But the long and short of like what he's trying to get at is that technology, he's kind of like a post-Heideggerian, that technology is this mode of revealing being in new ways. Like I was describing how, literacy, like the capacity to read and write, changed cognition earlier at the beginning of the stream. And you were describing just then about how the internet kind of has changed how people conduct themselves in like political discourse. And so like, technology has this effect where as we use it, it kind of changes our perception of ourselves, and that then proliferates with like new concepts and new awarenesses. And so I think he's kind of driving at that being like the essence of Promethean man is to constantly generate these new kind of prosthetic technological appendages to his being that expand the capacity of his consciousness to understand itself and the world and so forth.
All right, do you want to take one more question? We leave it there.
Sure, I don't mind. Yeah, whatever.
All right, Knight of Mirrors just sent one in for $5. Opinion on Indian growth as a regional competitor to China. The US has use for them, and Australia is partnering with them more. I guess that ties into that, like, what's it called, like the Blue Dot Initiative, which is meant to be like the US competing with the Belt and Road Initiative, where they have like India and Japan and some of these countries on board.
Yeah, India would never, I don't think, have the capacity to like truly rival China, but it could be part of a regional coalition that could. I know that India, Japan, Australia, and America are holding joint naval exercises currently. And ultimately, it makes sense that if we're not going to keep importing manufactured goods from China, because ultimately China's economy is obviously a manufacturing economy, they have to import all the natural resources to manufacture things, and then they need to export it to consumer markets. They don't have enough consumers or resources to do what they do. So if you start buying shit from everybody but China, then China collapses as a genuine rival. So it makes total strategic sense to say, okay, we're just going to move all the factories that are in China that are currently supplying, North America and Europe with all of our cheap crap to, India, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Indonesia, Vietnam, et cetera, Philippines or whatever. And so I think that's going to be what the Americans do. I mean, it's just the most obvious strategic move they could make. So I think India's a part of that, but I don't think, I mean, I don't know, I've been to India before, people, I guess you could say, not like some like anthill society like the Chinese are, but yeah, it's like an average IQ point differential of like 20 or something. And they just don't have the same kind of capacity, I think, to do really advanced manufacturing en masse like the Chinese have.
Yeah, actually, I remember I was watching recently. There's this guy that like goes, he does like travel vlogs in countries. He goes to countries and like tries to survive on no money and stuff, and he like gets free McDonald's and stuff. But the Indian one was, I don't know, it was kind of interesting. It's like they'd have like you'd go to a cinema and there'd be like one staff on the counter, but then they'd have like 7 or 8 security guards making sure no one snuck in, and then like you tried to get a free McDonald's and they were like a half hour with all the staff deliberating. I don't know. It was just some weird like honor thing where that was like such a big deal. Whereas in the West, it's like throw the guy a Big Mac. It means nothing in the
Yeah,
grand
I have a funny story actually. When I was in Bangalore, I go to the center of the city. I'm like walking around, just looking for something to do to pass the time. I'm in a new place. I'll go explore, and I get to the center of the city, and there's these like giant white steps, the only clean thing that I found in the whole city. And they go up to these like armored guards with AK-47s, and on the top of this like great central location is a KFC. And so I'm like, okay, let's try this out. So I walk up, and they're telling all the regular Indian people to piss off, and only like guys in suits that get out of like Lamborghinis and shit are allowed to go in. But me, because I'm white, come straight in. And I go in, and funnily enough, like the regular chicken was already hot and spicy, and then I got some of the hot and spicy chicken, and nearly like blew a hole in the back of my throat. But yeah, it was just hilarious that like the KFC was like the kind of pinnacle of like civilized culture in this society. So
it's kind of funny to imagine like sort of like shitlib Westerners going there like for the temples and stuff, and then like the most revered building is the KFC.
Yeah, but I mean, all the stereotypes are true. They are basically like every stereotype is true. So just if you know any stereotypes, assume they're correct.
All right, and I guess with that we can finish off. But yeah, it was good to have you on. Yeah, the post-liberal stuff is interesting. Definitely something I need to learn a bit more about myself. And yeah, if anyone is interested, as I say, your YouTube link is in the description. I'll add your Twitter as well. And as you said, the Discord for anyone that really wants to get into the theory. So yeah, thanks for joining, Joel.
Yeah, thanks, man.